How much are we going to miss out on as a society, as a civilization, in missed potential, in people who could have and would have and should have done X, but were stunted and were harmed during those couple of years of overreaction?
Hello. Welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on another guest who is a freedom fighter, another person who has been on the front lines with the COVID hysteria and fighting back against overreach by government. And it's none other than Topher Field. Topher, welcome to the Let People Prosper Show.
Vance, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you on. We met a while back, and you were telling me your story, and I was like, man, I've got to have you on my program for us to discuss this, because you've been through a lot, and you've done a lot, and you've changed people's lives in the process. And so I'm looking forward to getting into that. But before I do, for the audience, let me go ahead and read your bio here, and then we'll jump right into it. So Topher Field is the multi-award winning director of the documentary Battleground Melbourne. Got to check it out if you haven't seen it yet. I'm going to put it in the show notes page at vanceginn.substack.com as well. He's also the author of the book Good People Break Bad Laws. He's Australia's most awarded libertarian, including Libertarian of the Year 2022 and Libertarian Activist of the Year 2016. He's a 15-year veteran political commentator. He's a survivor of the longest and most violently enforced COVID lockdowns in the atmosphere, or the Anglosphere, I should say. He's a human rights activist on the front lines, including speaking at the very first illegal anti-lockdown protest in April 2020 with only 70 people, through to the very largest protests of the movement grew to hundreds of thousands of people when they were forced the government to back down in late 2021. But by far, Topher Field's proudest achievements are the 2 criminal charges which Victoria Police awarded him for his tireless work standing up for human rights and against the medical tyranny in Melbourne, Australia. During the COVID era, charges which Topher fought for 2 years and the police finally dropped. So much stuff going on there, Topher. So let me go ahead and get this started by asking the question I do with every guest. Why do you do what you do every day?
That's a good question. I wake up every morning and I ask myself the same thing some days. Why do I do this? No, look, I am an optimist. I am a dreamer, and I do believe that what we do can make a difference, even though, for the most part, life is not Hollywood. We don't get a Hollywood ending, but I don't need a Hollywood ending for what I do to be worthwhile. There is in me very much a sense of the need to be faithful, to the need to fight for what's right, regardless of whether I think I'm going to win or not, regardless of what I think the outcome is likely to be. I often find myself thinking about people like August Landmesser. He's someone I talk about quite a lot these days, but I was very aware of him prior to COVID, but what he did came into sharp focus for me during COVID. Now, he's someone that most of your viewers and listeners will have seen before, but they won't know it. They won't know that they've seen him. There's a black and white photograph that was taken during the early 1930s of a bunch of dock workers in Germany. And they're there at a political rally, and most of them are doing the Heil Hitler salute. And there's one person there with his arms folded. All right, most of us have seen this photo. There's one dude there, he's just standing there with his arms folded. Well, his name is August Landmesser, and he refused to participate in that salute to Hitler, and he refused to support the ideology that was represented in that salute. And the reason I think about him so much is because when he stood there with his arms crossed, refusing to buy into that crowd, that sort of mass formation psychosis, as we would call it today, he didn't know there was a camera. He didn't know that for all of posterity, we were going to remember what he did. And for a long time, we didn't actually. That photo was kind of discovered. It was unearthed decades later, and then we were able to track down who that individual was. And he had no idea the camera was there. He had no idea that his action was going to matter in any meaningful way, that it was going to become this symbol for all of history, testifying to the fact that not every German fell for it. He did it because it was right. And that was enough for him. And history and fate decided that what he did was going to become something so much more than that. The same is true of the tank man who stood in front of that column of tanks in Tiananmen Square in China. He didn't know there was a BBC crew up on a rooftop way over his shoulder somewhere over there. He had no idea. He didn't know that people were taking video, people were taking photographs, and that he would forever be a symbol of that moment in Chinese history. He did what he did because he believed it was right, and he was expressing his beliefs in his actions that day. So I'm a big believer in us doing the same thing. Now, in all likelihood, fate is not going to decide that I get remembered or that anything that I did gets remembered. That's a very rare thing, and fate does whatever it does. We have no real control over that. But that's
Yeah.
not the point of doing what's right. The point of doing what's right is doing what's right and having your own conscience testify to the fact that you stood and you did what was right, whether it was popular, whether you were punished for it, whatever the consequences were, you did what was right even when the world around you had lost its compass and lost its way.
Yeah, yeah, it's powerful, and I'm glad that you did that. You were doing what was right, although I'm sure it was challenging many days with your family and other things that were going on around you, and just you personally. I'm sure you took a lot of heat during that time, and I wonder what kind of got you to that point. Before we get into some of the more of the details about the COVID lockdowns and everything else, were you always a risk taker? Were you always the one who was on the front lines, willing to do that sort of thing?
No, quite the opposite, actually. It's kind of funny. I grew up as a super goody two-shoes. I was raised in a Christian conservative home. My dad's a
Yeah.
pastor. A couple of anecdotes from my childhood. In Australia, we have helmet laws for when you're riding a bicycle. You have to wear a helmet. Stupid, but we've got them as laws. And before the laws even came in, so they'd been passed, but they hadn't come into effect yet. There was a date at which they would come into effect. I began wearing my helmet because I was like, I'm going to start obeying a law that doesn't even exist yet. I was such a goody two shoes, and that you could look at many different aspects of my life as a kid. I was absolutely sickeningly obedient and proud of it. And what actually began my journey away from that was the time I spent a couple of years in the Army Reserves, which is much like it is in the US. It's sort of a part-time army. You're not at the same standard as full-time soldiers, but you're partly trained. And if something really goes sideways, then it's comparatively quick to get you up and ready to get involved. And so I spent 2.5 years in the reserves, and that was I described that as the moment I saw behind the curtain. Because the military, of course, is revered in conservative circles. This is an organization that is above reproach. You don't question the military, and you don't question our soldiers, and you don't question their motivations or their integrity or these sorts of things. And then you spend time in the military, and you realize how incredibly human and how incredibly normal it is. They are making decisions and behaving in much the same way that the crew at your local McDonald's would behave, only they're making life and death decisions. They've still got egos, they've still got prejudices, they've still got all of the usual hang-ups that I have as well. I'm not suggesting I'm any better.
Sure.
But you see behind that curtain and you realize that you've venerated and given this almost godlike status to an organization that is very brutally human. And that began my journey away from conservatism and towards libertarianism. So I'm still very personally conservative. The choices that I make for myself and for my family, very, very conservative choices. But when it comes to the policies that I would advocate for the government to have and to impose on others, I'm no longer a conservative. I'm very much a libertarian, and I believe that we need to be respecting the consciences of each individual to make what they believe to be the best decisions, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. If they're causing harm to others, well, that's another story. But that was really the beginning of that journey, but it didn't take its full form until COVID. When COVID came along, the lockdowns started. I very quickly figured out that the lockdowns were a disproportionate response to the risk. We had data out of Sweden, out of Israel, out of Italy that showed us very clearly who was at risk from the coronavirus. The lockdowns we had in Australia, in Melbourne, my hometown, became the longest and worst in the world. But at the time, obviously, when they started, that hadn't happened yet. And I was watching going, we're locking everyone in their homes for 23 hours a day and punishing people for going out and just doing ordinary everyday things. We're destroying people's businesses, destroying people's lives for a virus that's really mostly at risk to people over 70 with comorbidities and a very rapid decline in danger for anyone younger or healthier. This is a disproportionate response. I held my tongue for the first 2 weeks. It was 2 weeks to slow the spread. They did the same in the US, right? They were sort of talking about, 2 weeks we need to buy some
15 days
time
to slow the
health
spread.
system.
Yeah.
That's right. And there is, I will admit, there is at least a logic to that.
Sure.
I still think it's a violation of human rights, but there is a logic to it. But then the moment they said in Australia, we're just adding one more week to it, that's when I knew they're making it up as they go along. This is ad hoc stuff. They're not working to a plan, and they're violating human rights without an end game in mind, without an actual strategy for how to get out of this. And so that's when I began to speak out. And really, that was when I kind of, according to the government, I became a criminal.
Yeah. It's maddening, the things that were going on at that time. And it's interesting to hear your story, though, Topher, about, maybe not being on the front lines and everything else, but you saw the opportunity and you noticed something was wrong around you, and so you couldn't do anything else but to do what was right. Like you mentioned earlier, you did the right thing. I love that about you, and you and I were talking about this, but during that time, I was chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget, so I was working in the White House when all this was going down in the Trump administration, and was in the Situation Room, and we were watching kind of the cases going across, China and Europe and different places, and then across America, and trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And they were saying, "Hey, could your team of economists, I'm a PhD economist, and your team of economists help us to forecast where the virus is going to go?" I was like, "Well, no, we're economists. This is epidemiologist or something else that's going on." And then Situation Room, you hear from all these doctors and everything, but it didn't seem like they were willing to take into account the trade-offs of, okay, let's shut things down, let's get 15 days, but then what happens to the economy and everything else? And we put entrepreneurs on the sidelines from allowing them to overcome the obstacles like we usually have with everything else. And so it's unfortunate, but in America, Topher, we really didn't have the same sort of situation where people, I think, were willing to step out as often and as much as what I think you were doing there. And that's why I applaud what you were doing there. I was trying to do it in the White House. You were doing it over there. But what were some of the big, challenges that you faced as you went through all of that, those challenges in situations?
Sure. Well, let me first touch on what you've said. The argument was made in Australia, in the US, and everywhere else. Politicians kept putting their hands up and saying, we're just following the experts. We're just following the expert advice. And this is an act of cowardice. This is a capitulation from a politician. An expert, by definition, is a specialist in one area. The reason we aren't ruled by experts, we don't have a technocracy or an oligarchy, is because we need decisions to be made taking into account multiple areas. Right. And politicians have to be multidisciplinary. They have to be able to weigh up the trade-offs, as you say. And if we were just following the experts, well, we have no need of politicians at that point. We can just abolish them and just put a chief health officer in charge. Sure. The second point that I would make about these experts is that the minute an expert is appointed to a politically selected position, they are now politically compromised. Now, what I mean by that is, we had experts speaking out who were actually destroying their careers by speaking out. They're talking about things like hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or vitamin D or these various other things that we know would have moved the needle, would have reduced the severity and or quantity of disease from COVID-19. That's no longer controversial. We can actually say that on YouTube now and not get cancelled. For 3 years, we would get ripped down off YouTube for saying that. But so we had experts who were losing their careers to say that. And then we had other experts whose career was built on their willingness to deny it. And this is one of the litmus tests for me now when it comes to experts, because you can find an expert for every opinion. Which expert is willing to lose the most for expressing their opinion? It doesn't automatically mean they're right, but it definitely means we should have a good listen to them because the stakes are much higher for them. So you get a politically selected chief health officer, which is what we have in Victoria and in Australia. Not only do they have to be qualified medically, although even there that can be quite dubious sometimes. Often they've spent decades in basically administrative work. They might not have seen a patient for a very, very long time. But then they have to pass a political vetting process in order to be appointed to the role. And you have to ask yourself, what's the priority of the politician who's making that decision? Well, yes, they want good health advice, but also they want the politically expedient health advice. And this is where political incentives come in, and political incentives matter. As the old maxim, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. A politician's incentive is to do something. They have this overwhelming incentive to do something, even if it's not the right thing. Because if they do something and it turns out they did the wrong thing, they can still claim credit and go, well, can you imagine how much worse things would have been if I hadn't done something? The minute they don't do something, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. They're going to get blamed for everything, whether it's related to what they chose not to do anything about or not. So politically speaking, there's this overwhelming incentive for a politician to do something. So when they select a chief health officer, are they going to select an Anders Tegnell-style chief health officer from Sweden who says, hey guys, hold your horses, let's not overreact here? He was the exception. He was the single example of that on the entire planet, as far as I'm aware, with the possible exception of maybe a couple of state chief health officers in the United States. So he's the exception. Why? Because it's very rare that a politician would choose somebody who would give them that advice to sit in that position. The advice they want is do something, because that's politically expedient for them, and that's exactly what we saw. So anyway, coming back to your question.
No, keep going if you want, because I like where you're heading with that. In economics, we call it public choice economics, right? Where they're willing, the marginal cost and marginal benefits are different, and because they need to win a re-election, they need to be seen like they're doing something. So I think you're right on where you're going with that.
Yeah. So coming back to, I need to paint a picture of the reality of lockdowns in Melbourne, Australia, because it's quite shocking to people to realise this happened in a free country. Many Americans have expressed to me dismay. They were like, oh, Australia was always my backup plan if America really went to pot. And now it's scratched off the list. I'm like, well, sorry about that. I did what I could. I did everything I could.
Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So here was the reality that we lived with to varying degrees on and off over 18 months, and what added up to the longest lockdowns in the world. We could leave our house for 1 hour a day, but only for one of 4 or 5 approved activities. These included essential work. So if you weren't deemed essential, then you weren't even allowed to go to work. You couldn't open your business, etc. Essential work to get medical care, to provide essential care to people that couldn't look after themselves, or to do essential shopping and to do exercise. And they enforced these things with quite a recklessly gleeful abandon. So I'll give you some examples. Kmart, a big box sort of department store that we have here. I don't know if you have it in the US. Kids' clothing and bicycles, and as well as household essentials and so forth. They had to cordon off certain sections of their store based on what had been deemed to be an essential item and what was not. And you could get checked by the police as you left these stores. They would go through your bag to make sure that you'd only bought essential items and you hadn't done any non-essential shopping while you were out. It got to the point where, and this literally happened, elderly ladies were being arrested because they were sitting on park benches in the sun. They'd be 70 years old. They'd go for a walk out of their house to get some vitamin D and some exercise and some air into their lungs, and they sit on a park bench, and a police officer comes over and arrests them because they're not actively exercising at the time. We also saw a complete ban on protest, which is an instant violation of human rights. There's no two ways about that. And it was so ridiculous that people who were exercising would get arrested if they were wearing a shirt that had a slogan on it. And people would have slogans on their shirts or on their hats, and they would be exercising. And people were making a point of this. They were going out of their house and they were exercising and doing all the right things. And they were still getting arrested. Why? Because they had a slogan on their shirt. So there was absolutely zero tolerance of any public dissent. We got to the point we had an 8 p.m. curfew. People got arrested because they took their bins out to the curb in front of their suburban house after the curfew. We had a thing called the Ring of Steel. This was a series of checkpoints that had the military on them. The military were manning checkpoints around my home city. Wow. And you could not cross those checkpoints unless you had paperwork to prove that it was necessary for you to cross. They were literally and unironically sitting there and demanding papers, please. All right, and they did it with a completely straight face. It is literally true that children died because they were unable to access medical care because they were stuck on the wrong side of that Ring of Steel. That is a historical fact. Yeah. Such was the heartlessness with which this was enforced. And of course, people's lives are being destroyed. People are losing their minds. They're losing their marriages, their relationships. Elderly people were not able to be visited by their relatives when they were in palliative care. They're in the final days of life. They never got to have those final conversations. Young people lost their grandparents and adults lost their parents without having those last moments, those final conversations that are so precious, because we were afraid that they might pass on the Rona somehow to a person whose lifespan is measured in hours rather than even days. We lost our minds completely. And in that context, someone like me, who was going out publicly engaging in protest and publicly declaring that the lockdowns were an overreaction and that they were going to do more harm than good, and that we needed to open up and let people live and let the virus spread and just protect the vulnerable, protect the people that we knew were in the demographic that were at risk. Someone like me was literally being portrayed every single day. The Premier did a press conference every day, and he was portraying people like me as granny killers. He was using that expression. He was saying that we were irresponsible, that we wanted people to die. And what he was doing was he was praising the obedient. So he was really separating and dividing society. And he would praise the obedient with Orwellian phrases like, staying apart keeps us together. Staying home saves lives. These are really kind of 1984 newspeak kind of language. And talking about this is we're at war with a once in a lifetime pandemic, and you're on the front lines, and if you're doing the right thing, then you're one of the people helping us to win the war. And if your neighbor's not doing the right thing, then you need to dob them in. There was this incredible divisiveness that came in. And if you're okay with me ranting for a moment longer,
Yeah, go for it.
I want to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because what Daniel Andrews, the Premier of Victoria, did. Now, a Premier in Australia is like a governor in the US. The Premier of Victoria he spent millions of dollars on consultants, and they were psychological consultants that were telling him and advising him how to construct his messaging so that it would have the desired psychological effect. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs is at the center of the division, because in the hierarchy, you'd be familiar with it from high school, maybe from uni. It's a triangle. Across the bottom is the basic needs for survival: oxygen, food, water, shelter, these things that are physiological. If you don't have them, you will die in relatively short order. As you move up the hierarchy, the essentials are a given now, and now we care about things like relationships, purpose, meaning, legacy. These are not things that someone who's starving is particularly thinking about. The person who asks themselves, do I like my job? Well, that's a question that requires a certain level of privilege to ask yourself. The person who's hungry or whose kids are hungry doesn't really ask themselves whether they like their job. They just get on with it because they need the money. Yeah. So as you move up the hierarchy, we start to care about different things until eventually, at the very, very pinnacle of this hierarchy, you have this thing called self-actualization, where Maslow talks about this, and he says that self-actualization is basically, think of it as living your best life. You have a maximum sense of fulfillment, purpose. You're waking up every day absolutely pumped to be able to get out there and keep living. Life is the best it could possibly be. Now, the reality for most of us is we live somewhere clumped around the middle. We're in the middle of that hierarchy somewhere. Some higher, some lower, but very few in the Western world are struggling for survival, and very few in the Western world are self-actualized. We're all somewhere in the middle. Enter lockdowns. Now, lockdowns, because a whole bunch of people got deemed non-essential, shoves half the population towards the bottom. They can't open their business, they can't do their freelance work, they can't do their subcontracting, whatever it may be that their particular way of providing for their family is. Now, that, of course, destroys not only their income and their financial situation, but it also destroys their self-image, their identity, their purpose, so much about their psychosocial aspects of who they are. Yeah. That's a given. That's obvious. It's what happens to the other half that is actually truly powerful, and we need the world to understand this, because dictators and wannabe dictators will use this over and over again. What Daniel Andrews did to the other half, the ones that were either on fixed incomes, pensions, welfare, these sorts of things, or they were laptop workers so they could just work from home, or the government handed out money. And for some people, $700 a week was enough. They could live well on that. For some people, it was even better than what they were used to. But for many people, if you ran your own business and you had a crew and you had overheads, well, $700 a week is nothing. It's no, you're being destroyed. So for those where it didn't hurt them financially, it didn't push them down to a survival level on Maslow's hierarchy, not only did they get to stay where they were, they had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to move to the very, very top of Maslow's hierarchy. Here's how it works. All they had to do was get out of bed and by 11 o'clock be sitting there with a nice mug of coffee in front of the TV when Premier Daniel Andrews would come on. Every day for 120 days straight, Daniel Andrews was on. Pardon me while I fix my earpiece. This thing's becoming a bit of a pain. Every day for 120 days straight, Daniel Andrews was on our televisions giving us an update. And of course, we don't need an update every single day. The facts aren't changing that fast. And most of the updates could have been a 5-line email. There's no need for him to stand there and talk. And these things went for over an hour. Wow. And he would make minute micro adjustments to the rules. And he was constantly adjusting the rules and saying, well, this is today we had a situation at one point where we were allowed to go to parks and have outdoor picnics with people. We couldn't have them to our houses yet, but we were allowed to go to a park. I mean, just think about the madness of that. And so what was happening was people were there having beers and things. And so Daniel Andrews has a press conference and says, guys, we're changing the rules. You're no longer allowed to remove your mask to drink alcoholic drinks. You're only allowed to remove your mask to drink non-alcoholic drinks. Because presumably the virus can tell. Like, I'm not quite sure. Right. Like, if you're worried about a respiratory virus, maybe just make everybody drink whiskey neat. Like 40% alcohol is probably going to be good for killing whatever's in the back of the throat, right? Yeah. So he's making these absurd micro adjustments. The purpose was not the rules. The purpose was that you had to tune in every day and listen to his dulcet tones telling you once again what a good person you were because you were obeying the rules. And you need to dob in that evil neighbor of yours who's got lots of cars parked out the front of his house because you know he's not doing the right thing. And there's a reason why every single dystopian movie in history just about has this cliche of the face and the voice that is ubiquitous and everywhere. You can't escape the face on the big screens. You can't escape the voice coming out of the speakers. 1984, of course, Orwell wrote about that with the screens. There's a reason why that trope exists, because that's literally how it works. That is how they get inside people's heads. And what they're doing is not brainwashing.
No.
Not at all.
No.
What they're doing is dividing, and then with their chosen half of good people, they're giving them a sense of purpose and a sense of belonging and a sense of meaning, unlike anything they've ever experienced before. And here's the trick, Vance. They will never have it again, and they know it. Those few years, they got out of bed further up, higher on Maslow's hierarchy of needs than they have ever been before, and higher than they will ever be again. And deep down inside, they know it. And that's why when you go to these people with facts and with data and you explain, hey, this was a mistake, we shouldn't have done it this way, for them, they can't accept that. Not because they can't accept the facts, but because the facts have nothing to do with it. You are calling into question the best years of their lives. And they know the best years that they will ever have. They will never again have such an incredible sense of purpose and belonging and meaning. And that's why they can't let go of those years.
Man, yeah, powerful stuff there, Topher. I mean, I think you're right. And something that I've looked into on this is work, right, is something that brings dignity, respect, everything else. And people weren't working. I mean, they were forced to stay home and not work. And so to your point, they had to get it somewhere else, or rather they were forced to get it from somewhere else, and it being the government. I mean, they did that in the U.S. too. I mean, President Trump was basically going on TV every day, or Anthony Fauci or someone, to make these same sort of plays. It was almost like people were waiting for them to say, what's the next thing that I can do? And we just became so dependent on government. And as someone who's more libertarian myself, classical liberal, you know, I saw this happening in real time like you did. I was like, man, we've got to start fighting back. And it seemed like some of our more libertarian friends weren't willing to fight back as much. And so that's why whenever you and I were talking at this conference recently about it, I was like, you know, this is exactly what we need to be discussing more of. And I love the way you put that with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think that is so essential of where people were at during that period of time, because I'd love to know if in Australia you've seen this change in people's work ethic, their the time with others, getting outside. I mean, this is still going on. We're 4 years past when COVID hit, and people still don't want to go back to work. The labor force participation rates are still low. You know, unemployment rate seems low, but that's because so many people dropped out of the labor force and went on disability and other things. Are you seeing some of that being more of a longer term psychological change, given what all they went through during COVID?
Definitely. So my grandmother was raised as a child of the Great Depression. She wasn't old enough to be in the Great Depression herself, but she was raised as a child of the Great Depression. And that left an indelible mark. She never, you know, she was always bottling fruits, always preserving things. When a set of bed sheets wore out, of course, they were all flat sheets. She would cut it down the middle, flip the sides over, and sew it back up again because she couldn't bring herself to throw out. It's only worn out in the middle. The rest of it's fine. We'll just do this.
Right.
So she was a child of the Great Depression, and that left its fingerprints on her literally until the day that she died. And I think especially amongst younger people, that COVID era, we don't yet understand what those fingerprints are going to be in their fullness. They're still actually fermenting, and the consequences are going to be rolling on for a very, very long time. But those fingerprints, whatever they turn out to be in the long term, will be with those people for the rest of their lives. But it's also left a tremendous mark on a lot of older people, a lot of people who, you know, they lived the first 30, 40 years of their life pre-COVID. They have a reference point, unlike younger people that really don't have a reference point. A lot of grown-ups do. But I was in Melbourne. I went back to Melbourne recently. I've moved out of Melbourne, got my family out of there. We got out of all the big cities. We're in a much smaller regional centre now, closer to where the food is grown, you know, better community, all the rest of it. But I went back there for work purposes, literally just got back 2 days ago. And you walk through the central business district, or you'd call it the downtown area, I think is the American expression. We call it the CBD, the central business district. And it's dead. There's cafes are closed or working restricted hours. Shop after shop is for lease. You walk around. I can remember the Melbourne of my childhood and my teenage years and my 20s. If you had to walk through the downtown area, you were just being jostled and bumped and hassled. You couldn't get down the street because it was so busy with business people, with tourists, with students, with everything. And now it's like, I mean, there's still people there, but it's a fraction of what it always used to be.
Yeah.
And I realized what's happened is the office buildings are empty.
Yeah.
Businesses can't get their office workers to come back into the office. They're all still working from home. Now, that not only has an effect on productivity, because we know that a lot of people are just watching, football and doing whatever they want and just saying they're working.
Yeah.
But so it has an effect on productivity, but it also has an effect on the entire downtown area.
Yeah.
Now, what's really interesting to me, and Americans would be familiar with the idea that a downtown area in many cities is a rundown area. It's a higher crime, sort of a worse sort of an area. Certainly, pardon me, that's what I see when I go to America. I go there quite a lot.
Yeah.
That's not been the case in Australia. In Australia, the downtown area has historically been a really good area, bustling area, full of life, full of activity. And yes, okay, there's issues with crime, and yes, there's going to be some homeless people, and these sorts of things exist, but it wasn't the assumption that the downtown area was the derelict area.
Yeah.
But we've entered that phase now. Melbourne has certainly entered that phase where the downtown area is in decline, and I think it is so deeply ingrained in people after 4 years of trauma that I don't see that changing anytime soon. So the effect of this is unknown, and it's going to continue for decades.
Yeah. Yeah. And Topher, I think one of the things that I like to touch on a little bit and see what's going on in Australia is the effect on kids, right? Because here the schools were closed for a number of years, or at least a year and a half. So it was a lot of learning virtually. Well, quote unquote learning virtually. I'm not sure that they learned a whole lot, but that was the idea. And to your points earlier about the cases and the infections and how very few young people died. This was really about the old and the sick. They're the ones that we should have had more targeted resources to, compared to blocking everyone. One size fits all policies don't work very often, especially when this sort of situation. But in America, we're still seeing this education loss. And, I have an issue with a lot of government schools anyway. I'm for school choice. And so maybe we should be just forcing them into these cookie cutter boxes and everything. But this particular situation, I think, is going to be even longer lasting, to your point about people who are maybe 20s, 30s, or 40s. But we have some people who were, a junior or a senior in high school. So they're about to go into college, and their last couple of years, they didn't really get to socialize and be around people and everything else. And even younger kids, the teachers had to wear masks, so you couldn't see their mouth move. And so they didn't develop pronunciation of words as quickly as they otherwise would. And I wonder if you see some of that in Australia as well.
All of the same things. I mean, we got so crazy here. We shut down the schools. They also shut down playgrounds because they weren't allowing people to take their kids to playgrounds. Even in that 1 hour of allowed exercise, they wouldn't let people go. And one of my claims to fame is that I took my kids to a playground every single day while they were illegal.
Yes.
Illegal. Which is funny because I didn't used to do that before they were illegal. But the moment they said you can't do that, I'm like, F you, screw you. I'm doing it anyway.
Yeah. And Topher, did they happen to put the caution tape around it? Because they did that some here.
Taped them up. They chained up swings and things. Yes. They put concrete bollards onto skate parks or poured sand into skate parks. I'm dragging my kids along to like 6 parks a day. But Daddy, we're exhausted. We just want to go home. Shut up, kid. We're playing in the playground. The minute they said I couldn't do it, we were there.
Right. I love it.
But this is also crucial to a child's development. And here's the thing. We know this. Prior to 2020, go to 2019 or before, we understand that education is important. Now, I happen to share your concerns about the institution of schools, etc. I was homeschooled myself when I was a kid. I'm very grateful to my parents for that, and I'm homeschooling my kids. Yeah. But education is incredibly important. And we know that you change the quality of someone's education, you will change their economic outcomes, which then changes their life expectancy and health outcomes and changes the expectations and outcomes for their kids. When you destroy someone's education, you have a multi-generational impact on that person and their prospects and for life. And so what we did for these kids, and again, we don't know the full impact of this. We don't know, and I apologize, my earpiece has really decided to act up today. We don't know how long this is going to take for... Excuse me, I'm just going to drop it on the floor. How long this is going to take to play out, or really just how much damage is going to be done before it's sort of done. Is this... How many generations are now going to suffer because great granddad didn't get his education and wasn't able to start that business or wasn't able to be successful? How much are we going to miss out on as a society, as a civilization, in missed potential? in people who could have and would have and should have done X, but were stunted and were harmed during those couple of years of overreaction. To put it in really dumb terms, I don't really care about sport, but think about this. Think about the competitive disadvantage now that any young person trying to come up into college sports is at if they lost 2 years of competition due to COVID, due to lockdowns and so forth here in Australia. Or wherever they were, they're at a huge disadvantage. Well, I don't care about sports particularly, but that disadvantage exists in every area, the arts, technology, in business, in absolutely every area. We've put every single one of these kids on the back foot. And I think that's actually the bigger crime.
Yeah. It's depressing. But at the same time, as we're wrapping up some here, this is a great discussion, man. We should talk about it more sometime. What do we learn, right? Like, how do we make sure we won't do this again? Because my fear, Topher, and you probably share this, is that now we've already set a precedent. We've set a precedent that this can happen, that they can make us live. We feel like we can live for a while, and they'll give us all these handouts and goodies, and some people will reach self-actualization again. And so if they come out for environmental reasons, the climate change crisis, whatever else it may be, how do we avoid some of this in the future, Topher?
Yeah, that's what we do need to be talking about. And shameless plug, that's exactly why I wrote this. Good people break bad laws.
There you go.
And I talk about this in here. So here's the thing. You and I believe in limited government, right? We believe that the government should have limits. It shouldn't just be able to do whatever it wants to anyone at once, anytime at once, for whatever reason it wants. And in fact, almost every single person, with very few exceptions, believes in limited government. We argue about where that limit should be, but almost no one argues that there should be no limits. So here's the thing. Throughout history, we've seen humans try and figure out, how do you effectively limit government? How do you allow it to do the things it needs to do and not allow it to do the things that it shouldn't do simultaneously? How do you get that balance right? We've tried things like constitutions, constitutional monarchies or constitutional republics or various forms. Democratic systems have been developed, sometimes elitist democratic systems like the Senate in ancient Rome or in Greece, through to full franchised democratic systems like what we have in the Western world today, where everyone over 18 gets to vote regardless of their social status or income or any of these things. We've tried bills of rights. The US has a bill of rights. How's that working out for you guys? The Second Amendment is half of what it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
The Fourth Amendment is violated every single day with glee and without any consequence for the police. The First Amendment has to be defended relentlessly in court because people are constantly trying to violate it and sometimes succeeding, although not always. That's the one that does still have a little bit of life left in it. But as a means of limiting government, the US Bill of Rights is not succeeding. We've tried separation of powers. We have different branches of government that are all supposed to hold each other accountable. It's like having different mafia families that are all supposed to hold each other accountable. Well, yeah, they'll go to war sometimes, but mostly they're all just interested in their own self-interest and growing the overall power of the mafia.
Yeah.
So every single one of these things either has failed or is failing. So that begs the question, if we believe in limited government, how do we, in practical terms, achieve it? And the answer historically is that the only thing that limits the power of government is when the people reach the limit of their obedience. Right? The only thing that limits the power of government is when the people reach the limit of their obedience. And that's true whether you have a Bill of Rights or not. A Bill of Rights, a constitution, all these things, they're words on a page. Now, they're useful, but they still require people to run out of patience and go, no, I'm enforcing this thing. You've reached the limit of what I'm going to allow you to do, government, and I'm now going to hold you accountable to this document. Because if there's no one holding them accountable to the document may as well not exist. It's still about the people reaching the limit of their obedience. So let me roll into this, and this might be a good place to leave it, but I'll leave that in your capable hands. My question to everyone, to literally everyone, every one of your viewers and listeners, to yourself personally, to everyone that I can reach, and I'm on a crusade now, I'm trying to reach as many people as I can, is, do you have a limit to your obedience? And that's an easy question. Oh, yeah, of course I do. Okay. Do you know where it is? Will you recognize it when it's reached? Because I can tell you, there's an awful lot of people coming back to me now with deep regret, saying, I'm sorry I wasn't there with you in the early days of COVID. It took me a year to realize. It took me 18 months to wake up and realize what was going on. Their limit got passed, and it took them a year to see the fact that the limit had been all the way back there, way back in history. That's when their limit was breached, and they didn't even recognize it. So do you have a limit? Do you know where it is? Will you recognize it when it gets exceeded at the time, not in hindsight? And then this is the crucial one, the third one. There was a police officer in Melbourne who He was one of the anti-terror police, dressed in full body armor with automatic weapons, all the rest of it, out on the streets of Melbourne. They never shot live ammunition at us, but they shot everything else: rubber bullets, tear gas. They drove armored cars down the street, beat the crap out of people. They did everything except for live ammunition. And here's this police officer and a very brave protester. I don't know who it was, but we have the video. He had his phone in his hand, just sort of swinging by his side, but he was recording. And this police officer says to him, "Go home, or we'll start arresting people. We'll start issuing you with fines. Go home. We don't want to do it, but we will." And the protester says, "Well, if you don't want to do it, don't do it."
Yeah.
And he says, "Well, I have to. My wife's out of a job at the moment. I have to put food on the table." And the protester says, "Well, what about those of us who are out of a job? We need to put food on the table as well." And he goes, "Yeah, I get it. I hear you. But I'm not qualified to do anything else at this time in my life. This is the only job I can have. And so I have to do what I have to do." He literally used that extra, I got to do what I got to do. And the protester said, "No, you don't have to do this." And they remonstrated for a while and then went their separate ways. And what is highlighted by that clip with that police officer is that his responsibility to his family, which is real, right? His responsibility to provide for his family had been weaponized by the government against his conscience. And he was put into a position, which, to be fair, he should never have been put in, where he had to make a choice between obeying his conscience and, in a sense, betraying his family and letting his family down, or looking after his family and betraying his conscience. Now, he should never have been put in that position. Let me be clear about that. But there's another layer to this. We can't control whether we get put into that position or not. That happens above our pay grade. All we can control is how we respond. And so my challenge to each and every person is think about your own life. Audit your own life. Those excuses that were coming out of his mouth, what's your version of that excuse? What's the thing that may be a very real and valid responsibility that you have? "Oh, I have to take the jab because otherwise I'm letting down my students." Okay, you don't want to let your students down. That's a noble impulse. That's a good drive that you have to want to look after your students and to be there for them. But it's been weaponized against your conscience, and now you're going to have to make a decision. So I think what each and every one of us needs to do is to audit our own lives, to ask ourselves, what's going to come out of my mouth, or what's going to pop into the back of my head that's going to tempt me to do the wrong thing for the right reasons? And is there a way I can fix that in advance? What if that police officer had some other investments, maybe owned a couple of rental properties, or had a decent share portfolio, or had started a side hustle, selling FBA on Amazon, or whatever it might be? Would he have felt quite so trapped? There's ways, there's things that we can do, whether it's your medical care that I can't do what my conscience requires me to do because the government won't let me seek this medical care, or won't let me keep this job, or won't let me finish that sentence for yourself, right? What is that thing? And fix it in advance. Because here's the thing, if you are not willing to fix the temptations that would make you want to compromise and to not limit your obedience, if you're not willing to fix those things, then you don't actually believe in limited government. Because you cannot say you believe in limited government if you are not willing to limit your obedience at some point in time. And if you're not willing to fix the things that will make you compromise, then you don't believe in limited government at all. And that's my challenge to as many people as I can reach. Audit your life. Identify these weaknesses in advance and fix them, because your test is coming. Believe me, it'll be environmental, or it'll be another pandemic, it'll be something. Your test is coming. And can I finish with this? I had the most incredible day of my life. Had the most incredible day of my life. It was November 20th, 2021. It was a day when over 100,000 people got together in a park in the biggest political protest that my home city has ever seen. And I got to speak to that crowd of people because I'd been there right from the start. And I got to see that movement grow from 70 people. And over 18 months, where we got the crap kicked out of us by the police. We faced riot police, we faced mounted police, we faced armoured vehicles, we faced rubber bullets and tear gas. I'd been arrested and I had criminal charges hanging over my head that were completely unjust and a complete abuse of the legal system. We faced all of that. And we never gave up, and we persevered and we pushed through. And finally, the government backed down. What actually happened was Victoria Police backed down. They wrote an open letter and they published it publicly. And they wrote an open letter to the government and they said, "We're not doing the violence anymore. It's time to put away the tear gas and let these people protest." And it took 18 months of us being on the receiving end of all of that violence and all of that intimidation and all of that abuse of power before finally their consciences got the better of them and they finally did what they should have done at the very, very start. And then suddenly we had 100,000 plus. I mean, Sky News actually reported 450,000, or at least that's what I'm told. I never saw the report. I'm told they reported that, and then shortly afterwards that they'd pulled that report. I don't know. What I know is that we have video, drone footage, and other video footage where we can safely say there was 100,000 people there. Wow. And I got to speak to that group of people and feel what that's like and the roar of those people. And the sense of pride that I have, the knowledge that I passed the test. I faced the same test that police officer did, but where he has to spend the rest of his life justifying himself in his own conscience for why he violated his conscience. I get to live the rest of my life knowing that I passed my test when it came. Yeah. And that's an incredible thing to live with. And that's what I want for each and every other person. And that's why I want every single person to be thinking through right now, what are the things that are going to tempt you to compromise? What are the things that are going to make you fail that test? And are you willing to fix them now? Because believe me, your test is coming, and I want you to pass because I want you to live like I do with the knowledge that you passed your test.
Amen. Amen. Wise words, Topher. Thank you for all you're doing and all you have done. And I'll make sure to put all this in the show notes page. People need to go out and watch your videos, read your books. Just a lot of great information that you're passing along. God bless you and your family, and keep up the great work, Topher.
Thank you, Vance. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Great discussion overall. We've got a lot to look forward to, given that we can stand the test of time, to make sure that we're standing on the front lines like Topher is. It's very important for us to do that and fight back where we need to along the way. If you enjoyed this discussion, please give us a 5-star rating. Share it with your friends and family. They need to understand this information just as much as you do, and everything else. And until next time, let people prosper.